Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. My name is Neil Perkin. I'm the moderator and facilitator of Google Firestarters. And for the uninitiated, Firestarters was a series of events that we ran at Google for over 10 years. We've pivoted them now into a series of virtual chats with the interested and interesting of the advertising and marketing community. And I'm delighted to say that today's guest is no exception to that. We're lucky to have Andy Nairn, who is the founder of one of the most successful creative agencies in the UK, Lucky Generals. So Andy, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So I set up Lucky Generals with two best friends, Helen Calcraft and Danny Brooke Taylor, about 7 years ago, and still very much enjoying it.
Fantastic, good. Okay, and as you know, the Firestarters is really formatted around 5 key questions, really, around learning. So what's the biggest learning you've had, and around the biggest mistake you've made in your career, what you learned from that as well. But also about your insights into how the industry is changing, predictions for the future, and then we've got a catch-all question at the end, which is about what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you. So I'm going to leap straight in with that first question, if that's okay, and just ask you about learning. So what is the best thing that you've learned in your career to date?
It's about the importance of culture, and actually particularly the importance of fun culture and having, being able to enjoy yourself. None of us, really at the moment are probably having the best times ever. I mean, a lot of the time it's quite tough at the moment, isn't it? I'm sure I've certainly sort of found it a bit of a struggle sometimes over the last year or so. But I think almost precisely because it has been tough, that just reminds you that what we do is not rocket science. It doesn't tend to be a matter of life and death, like a lot of other people have got like really sort of proper and serious jobs. So while we've got to do our work seriously and give it due process and make it robust and all the rest of it, I think we just also have to try, if we possibly can, to sort of carve out a bit of fun, because otherwise life is too short to be sort of slogging away, working on stuff that we don't enjoy or with people that we don't have fun with, I think.
So that's really interesting you say that, because I think you spoke at Firestarters a few years ago, and one of the things you said there was about how sometimes the profession can get a bit over ponderous and a bit sort of inwardly facing and chin stroking perhaps, and maybe strategists are kind of the guiltiest party of that. Do you think really that actually we overthink things as an industry too much sometimes?
I think we definitely can. I think we, I'm all about action. I like a really active style of planning. I like doing things, making things. I feel like we're sort of in the manufacturing industry. I would never want to work on something that didn't have some kind of tangible output. That's not to say obviously there has to be advertising, but increasingly it isn't. But I feel like it's got to end up with something happening in the real world, and thinking doesn't get you anywhere unless it's sort of applied. So I think in particular, given we increasingly know that consumers don't think very much when they buy the products that we're trying to promote, it's sort of unhelpful for us to sort of really dwell and overthink stuff when we could actually just be doing and making things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just interested also to ask you a bit about your book, because you wrote a book recently called Go Like Yourself, which is all about, I guess, sort of stacking the odds in your brand's favor, really, isn't it, for marketing and advertising? And I think one of the things you've written about before is about how sort of processes sometimes can eliminate luck in a process, and it feels a bit like that's what you're saying here about just sometimes if we think too much and we're just going through that process, that we take the luck out of everything and the fortune. I mean, what do you really mean by that? How can that happen?
So I think sometimes in our quest for perfection and making everything just right, which sounds absolutely laudable, doesn't it? But actually that can sometimes be another sort of corporate excuse for not doing anything. We've probably all worked with companies or in companies where they put everything off because they're always fine-tuning and honing, and let's just do one more round of research, or let's just bring it back to the board or back to whatever sort of stakeholder group. And it sounds very sensible because it's done ostensibly with the aim of making things better, but actually what often happens is nothing happens, and then someone else will get out into the field and do, a competitor might have a slightly less good product, but they will make it, or they will make it happen, or they will run the campaign that we should have run. but we were sort of too busy fine tuning it. So I feel perfectionism actually, and there's now been a lot of research done this in all sorts of fields, perfectionism is not particularly helpful sort of attribute for companies or people to have. And I think, again, it's part of this sort of loosening up and just, accepting that we live in an imperfect world. You're better to get something to about 80 or 90% and make it happen than to sort of dwell on it. And then you move on, you learn and you move on and you go on to the next thing. But I feel like that also helps the corporate sort of memory muscle, because you learn so much more from doing something in the real world than thinking about it in a sort of a boardroom. And my sort of thing about luck is that, we, as you say, we often use luck as a bad term, don't we? We sort of talk about, let's leave nothing to chance. Whereas actually, usually luck should be a good thing, shouldn't it? Surely, we should be wanting to bring luck into this sort of conversation and apply luck to our lives rather than sort of keep it out.
Yeah, and I think I read also one of the pieces in Contagious where you were talking a bit about not having your head so buried in a task that you're blind to all the other opportunities around you. And I think actually there was a great experiment that Professor Richard Wiseman did, which you mentioned, which is about getting people to count the number of adverts in a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
the people had self-defined themselves whether they were lucky or they classed themselves as unlucky. And the lucky people were able to count the number of ads a lot quicker, but that's because they typically noticed the message which was on page 2 of the newspaper, which told them how many adverts were in the paper. So in other words, it kind of seems to say that actually the unlucky people was kind of like were buried in that task, and say they were actually just going through the process. Is there something here about just being overly fixated on one thing and just going through processes, not really lifting your head up here?
Definitely. I think I love that experiment. He's repeated it many times and it always has the same results. And yeah, I like this idea that, sometimes when we say that we're unlucky, it's just because we're not spotting all these opportunities. So those people that had their heads down and were concentrating on the task that the researchers had given them just didn't spot the answer that was screaming at them on page 2. And the people that were lucky, all it really means is that they were more likely to spot that. And I think, I think that's always a problem for our industry, because we're always, if we're not careful, prone to have our heads down, thinking about our industry, our sector, let's make right. We're an ad agency. We've been given a task of making ads, and it's for this particular sector, so that's what we will sort of focus on. Actually, if you pull back out, there's almost always a bigger business problem that we should be thinking about that might not be solved by advertising. And we can learn from all these other categories. And I think especially at the moment, because of course, because of the last 12 months, we're all probably even more inclined to have our heads down and buried in the the stresses of everyday life and the sort of our immediate sector. Whereas actually, there's even more reason why we should be having our keeping our heads held up and looking around to what we can learn from all sorts of other places.
Yeah, it's interesting you said about the importance of learning from other categories and sectors. Do you think the advertising and marketing industry does a good enough job of that, of learning from other sectors, functions, disciplines?
No, I don't think we do, actually. I think there's a sort of I think there's an inbuilt bias against that to some degree, because I feel there's a lot of specialisms that are built up, aren't they? That car advertising must be like this, and we don't always hire from people, don't often cross over between sectors, so that, for instance, if you're a car marketer, you stay within car marketing. If you're finance, quite often there are people who've only spent their lives in finances. And I think actually that's one of the great things that an agency of any sort can do, is to, we can never match our clients in terms of that deep sector specific knowledge, but we can bring learnings from other sectors to bear. We can say, well, actually, although you are in the car sector, here's something that we've learned on the beer sector, something completely unrelated, that you might think, well, that's a sort of a ridiculous sort of analogy to sort of make, but actually they're sometimes the most interesting ones. That's where serendipity, which is a type of luck, comes from. In a sense, the happy accident, the collision of two unexpected sectors can often make for something actually really interesting, but we have to have our heads up to do that.
That's really interesting. And just sort of staying with the theme of learning, I'd love to know what your biggest mistake is actually in your career, what you think that is, and actually what you've learned from that.
You know, that's a really, it's one of these brilliant questions in a way that it's really tempting to say something like, yeah, my biggest mistake is I'm too kind or too, you know, hardworking or whatever. But I'm going to tell you, a genuinely truthful one, which was a big mistake at the time, or it certainly, you know, felt that way. And I'll tell you what I learned from it, because I think that's obviously the point of, I guess, this exercise is. So the big mistake was about 12 years ago. Me and the two people I mentioned, who, you know, my fellow co-founders of Lucky Generals, Helen and Danny, we were in the process of selling the final stage of our previous agency, which was called MCBD, and we'd been selling in stages to a Canadian company. I won't go through all the details, but the point was we had sort of one of these sort of game show moments where we could take the final tranche of money for that agency and then maybe set up our own agency, which is just something we thought about, or we could sort of roll it into some new enterprise. And at that time, that company that we'd been selling our, you know, stock to, also owned a company called Dare, who were a very good agency. So at the time, we were on a high. We'd just become the IPA effectiveness agency of the year, and we just added the decade for Hovis. We were covered in awards and good profile and, you know, sort of momentum. And Dare were the digital agency of the decade. So it seemed like, you know, if you remind yourself what it was like 12 years ago, it seemed like an amazing moment to bring a great creative, you know, brand building agency together with a brilliant digital agency, merge them and have the best of both worlds. And on paper, you know, everyone at the time greeted it as that, wow, that's a really brave and inspirational, you know, smart, forward-thinking thing to do. And you know what? It just wasn't. It didn't work out. There were lots of lovely people on both sides. It wasn't, you know, because there was any animosity. It's just mergers are messy, you know, and even with good intentions. In fact, if anything, they are more problematic. And I think where we probably went wrong collectively was we were too nice about it. You know, I think where mergers tend to work better is if it is a genuine takeover. You know, and one side just sort of, for clarity, is established as the sort of dominant partner, and perhaps we were too nicely dancing around the, you know, how it was all going to work. Anyway, for whatever reason, we didn't, you know, enjoy it. And as I said, to me and to Helen and Danny, our sense of enjoyment and fun is very much at the heart of our work and how we get the best of ourselves. So we're not the sorts that can just grit our teeth and bear it and, you know, be miserable for a few years and, you know, make some money. So actually we decided to call it quits. And so we left. So it was a painful sort of year, 18 months maybe. And we couldn't work together for a little while because we had restrictions. But what it did, and this is the point of it, is I guess it massively reminded us what we did want to do. You know, sometimes you have to go through something you don't want to do and just told us, yeah, well, we don't want to ever do that again. We do actually want to set our own thing up, and perhaps we should have done it back then, but we've learned actually quite a lot in this process that is going to be helpful. And it turned out to be the best thing we'd ever done in a weird way, you know, in retrospect, even though it felt like a horrendous thing at the time, because it brought us together, it reminded us of all our shared sort of beliefs. And it made us actually, the fact that we couldn't work together for a few months made us almost like coiled springs that, you know, we wanted to sort of start this new agency and get back on track. So it gave us an amazing sort of momentum when we set up Lucky Generals. So my sort of, I suppose my broader point is that, you know, often when you've made a mistake like that, don't dwell on it too much, because it might turn out to be quite a good thing. You know, don't beat yourself up. You know, recognize it, move on, and, you know, sometimes it turns out to be actually a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess I'm curious to ask, because you talked in the answer to your first question about culture and the importance of that. And so when you were setting up your the new agency, having gone through that experience, how did you kind of think about the culture of the agency, you know, set a culture that actually was one that you wanted, and that when people joined, that they felt that it was, you know, the fun part that you mentioned as well before. So how as a leader of an agency, you know, setting up a new agency like that, how do you set that culture? How do you kind of create that essence of what you want it to be like?
I think first of all, you do it by example. You know, so the fact that the three of us are, you know, close personal friends, is hopefully some form of good example. I'm sure not all the time, but we try to lead by good example and the way that we work with each other. It's also about having principles and saying no, to a lot of stuff. And we decline a lot of new business opportunities that could have been very lucrative, but we knew that we wanted to set off in a particular direction. And it's also it was very important for us for right from the beginning for the generals to mean everybody in the agency. That we could perhaps lead by example, the three of us, but we're not the generals. We're it's not like we're the sort of the top soldiers and everyone else is just the sort of foot soldiers. No, everyone's a general. So literally every single person that came in, I think we've pretty much interviewed everyone in any role, right down to sort of more administrative roles, because they've got everyone's got an incredibly important sort of job in a company of our size. If one person joins, then they're more than 1% of our company. So that all adds up. And what we've been trying to do since is, and I think the really important thing is to make sure that you don't calcify. That the culture keeps growing and we bring in new and diverse sort of input so that it sort of keeps evolving. It's not set in stone. But you set the original path, and I think it's been lovely watching it sort of grow and develop.
It must be hard when you're kicking off a new agency to say no to stuff. I mean, that must be really difficult, because obviously the temptation would be to just get going but if you want to set a particular direction, I mean, how do you really how do you do that? How do you make sure that actually that you can create that space and freedom for yourself to say no?
Well, that's where I think that the previous not happy experience was really helpful. We were so intent on enjoying ourselves that it was such a good sort of starting point, if you like. So before we even set up, in the sort of interim, before we'd formally opened, and we got offered a ridiculous amount of money, if I'm honest, by a financial services company to give us their business, without a pitch. And we could have taken the money at that point, but we sort of figured that from day one, it was a sort of a slightly murky, probably not very much fun finance company that would shape the nature of the agency going forward, because I think what you're created in the likeness of your clients. And we thought if we take all that money, okay, that will be sort of advantageous in the financial sense, but that is going to pigeonhole us as or that is going to sort of set us off on one track, and not create the sort of ambition that we want. And what we did instead was we turned that down. And then the first thing that came along was effectively, I wasn't quite pro bono. In fact, I lost us loads of money, but it was a Paddy Power project about homophobia in football. It was called Rainbow Laces. And we ended up creating this amazing sort of campaign for them, literally on a shoestring. So it was using rainbow coloured boot laces to sort of promote or to tackle homophobia in football. And we lost tons and tons of money, but it set out our stall as fun, fizzy, exciting, cultural, challenger kind of agency. And then what that does is it brings lots of other people to you. So you just have to hold your nerve. I mean, I think the answer is you have to believe in yourself and back yourselves. And because we had previously had that little stumble, we now really were determined to back ourselves for better or worse. And if it didn't work, well, then fine. But you just got to tell yourself, stick with your principles.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I'm going to take that back out to the industry now, because I'd love to get your thoughts on how you think the industry is changing, really. So obviously lots going on, but how you really think the industry is actually fundamentally changing. What do you think your answer is to that?
Oh, wow, there's so many changes. I think one of the really exciting changes from a planner's point of view is just how much more sort of empirical knowledge there is about how brands are built and how markets work now. When I came into the industry, there was some great textbooks, but there was nothing of the scale of all the Byron Sharp work and Les Binney and Peter Field and Tom Roach and all these incredible studies that have been conducted about what actually happens in real life. So I think that's really interesting and exciting. What I sort of I'm frustrated by is often that the industry hasn't, our output hasn't always caught up with that knowledge. I mean, it's because we can quickly go on our feed from reading, absolutely empirical data about how you should build a brand, and then the next thing you see in your feed is something that just absolutely bears no relation to that whatsoever. So that's frustrating, but I feel like we will catch up. We've got to, or smart agencies will. And I think we will increasingly see that that data is the friend of creativity rather than its enemy. It's not about creating rules. It's about liberating us and helping us make more effective work.
Yeah, it's really interesting you're saying there about how the output has not caught up with the kind of knowledge that we have now. And what's stopping that? Why do you think that happens?
I think there's a lot of there's still quite a lot of not unprofessional, but sort of mystical, let's say, sort of promotion of ideas that don't necessarily work. I'm a big believer in that purpose can be, for instance, a really powerful way to build a brand if it's done in the right way. But also there's just like a lot of absolute nonsense talked about it as well, as if it's a sort of panacea that applies to every brand, and can be sort of falsely created, frankly, almost for the purpose of winning awards. I often sort of feel is the purpose of it. And so because there's a lot of work being generated along those lines that's got no relation to what we know about how brands are genuinely built, but it wins awards, that becomes self-fulfilling, unfortunately. And we just try not to play that particular game. If you play the long game, I think clients really appreciate the work that is going to do a proper job for them in their market, rather than something that will win at Cannes and sort of impress the tiny little village of people in our industry.
And tell me a bit more about, you said there that the data is the friend of creativity, and this is an interesting one because it feels quite polarized at the moment between advocates of a data-driven sort of approach and advocates of a very creative-driven approach, and unnecessarily so. So what's the way in which you think they can come together to really create great work?
I think it's data. The data in itself is nothing, is it? It's the insight that you get from the data. So again, it's all about application. It's using the data, and sometimes I think putting it center stage. I love stuff like the Spotify work. Where they take all the listening data. That's like a gold mine sitting in front of them. But what they cleverly appreciate, because loads of companies have got data like that, but they've cleverly taken that data and put it center stage, haven't they? And had lots of fun with it, because our listening habits can say bigger things about who we are as people and the state of the world that we're in. So I love that as a sort of a way forward. That's a genuinely creative use of the data. I think quite often our use of data is quite small and incremental. But I think if you can make something really big out of it and elevate it, I think that's where a lot of my excitement comes from.
And I think in your book as well, you talked a bit about uncovering organisations' sort of hidden treasures, and also turning misfortune into fortune. I know you've sort of written about the Guinness campaign as being one of your favourites, and that whole thing about it comes to those who wait and everything, and turning that into just a really brilliant campaign. And so those kind of hidden gems and the hidden treasures in organisations, do you think sort of there's an opportunity here for strategies and planners to really use data and to just get really under the skin of companies to find gems like that and turn misfortune into fortune? Is that the role of creativity in data?
Yeah, that's sort of what I meant by sort of luck. So in the book, one of the themes, or one of the ways that you can maximize your luck, is to appreciate what you got. And there's loads of research about individuals that backs that up, that the more we appreciate the things that we've been given in our life, the more successful we become, because it's being mindful of the benefits that we all have. But actually, that applies to organizations, and a lot of the time those answers are sitting right in front of them. So we've talked about data. This pile of data that lots of companies are sitting on, but it's just a lot of them don't appreciate how valuable that data is. Or it can be history. I talked about Hovis earlier. Well, that was realizing that they had this amazing history that was a positive thing, rather than as they had been viewing it as a really negative thing. So helping organizations appreciate the treasures that they've got, whether it's provenance or history or a sense of timing, or they might have an amazing brand character. Again, that's one of those empirical learnings. We know that sort of stuff works, but a lot of companies just don't appreciate that. They think that characters and slogans or visual devices are old hat and a bit embarrassing almost, whereas all the data shows that they work. So I think appreciating what you got is one thing, and then turning misfortune into good fortune, like the example I just gave from my own career. But very often what looks like bad luck turns out to be good luck. So when you apply to work, things like the Guinness campaign I love, because it takes something that is a problem with Guinness, the fact that it takes ages for the pint to be poured, but brilliantly repositions that as a good thing, because it's all about anticipation and good things come to those who wait. And I think very often this is the pratfall effect, isn't it? We appreciate brands that acknowledge a flaw, or you don't pretend that they're perfect. That actually makes us like them more. So actually starting with something that is a negative about your brand can be a really powerful way of convincing people that generally is really good.
I guess that's the value of an outside perspective, isn't it, as an agency, of actually seeing that sat outside the company and the client company. And do you think that's because client companies are sort of too close to it, and they're just don't really see what they've got there? So actually, the value of the outside perspective is really useful like that.
Yeah, absolutely, and obviously not to diminish the amazing role that client companies have got all sorts of gifts that we don't have, but I think that what we've got to do, if we become too like our clients, then we're finished. There's no point in having us. So we might as well trade in the one thing we do have, which is, as you say, it's that outside objectivity. So that is, often when clients are so close, when they've seen that logo a million times, it ceases to have any meaning for them. There's a lovely story about Trevor Beatty and FC UK, where he was waiting in their reception, I think, and a fax, he was waiting for a meeting, and a fax machine, shows how long ago the story is, was sort of churning out bits of paper, headed paper with FC UK, and he sort of just smiled to himself and thought, that's quite funny, FC UK as a line, and that became the sort of kernel of his great and provocative campaign, with that featuring that as a sort of playing on the swear word as an alternative. And I think sometimes that sort of stumbling on things, the other great example is John Hegarty spotting the Vorsprung technique poster on a wall and bothering to ask what it meant, and then actually having the genius idea of transplanting it without translating it to the UK. And I love that story because it's on the wall. I mean, it's like they must have passed that poster thousands of times without ever imagining that it would work in another country. Sometimes those answers are lying there in the sort of in plain view, and we just have to help people uncover them.
Yeah, and it's really nice sort of think about being as a planner and a strategist, observing, but also something about curiosity, I guess, here. Do you think curiosity is one of the qualities which makes for a good strategist and planner?
Definitely. Curiosity, looking at things in a different way, seeing the same thing as everyone else has seen, but thinking something different about it is often the key, isn't it? And then as we've talked about, keeping your eyes open for, having the curiosity to wonder what would happen if I took this idea from that sector and apply it over here. What would happen if I thought about this through the lens of maths or science or religion or politics or psychology? I think having very eclectic reference points rather than just viewing everything through our sort of narrow lens is where a lot of the best ideas come from.
Brilliant. So let's sort of think about the future now, and I'm just going to ask the question around your prediction for the future of advertising or marketing, take it whichever way you want. So what do you think? Where do you think the industry is going? What's your prediction?
Well, it's very possible to be quite Black Mirror here, isn't it? And sort of a slightly pessimistic about some of the things that we're doing, because we are making a few mistakes, I think. But I'm generally a very optimistic person. I'm going to say that we're going to learn from some of the things that we've gone through over the last year, and actually perhaps leading up to the last year, and we're going to become more cooperative. So we do a lot of work with the Co-op, for instance, which has been their business model obviously for about 175 years. But I think increasingly there's a sense that a lot of the big challenges that we face as a planet or as country can only be solved by us coming together. And we've done a little bit more of that over the last year because we've had to. We're now going to go in a climate crisis. We're going to have to cooperate to address that. Things like food poverty and all these other sort of big issues. I feel there's a greater sense that brands are going to have to do things with each other rather than against each other. So I'd love to think that some of us might hold on to some of those principles rather than just chuck them back up in the air and get back to battering each other sort of senseless.
So is that about seeing the bigger picture? Is it about sort of brands working together in interesting ways?
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to show itself?
Yeah, I think it's going to be about sharing data and learning for mutual advantage. And it's not sort of, it sounds some sort of like hippie dream, and sort of, I know that there's an argument this way, but that might work in the world of, where there's a sort of a good cause at heart, and we're doing things for the planet or for, to in the face of a pandemic, but wait till we get back into the cutthroat world of competition. And then obviously we all have to compete with each other. But I think a lot of companies are realizing that one way to compete is by joining forces with other brands. So you think about one of the biggest ideas probably in business thinking over the last 20 years is the idea of the ecosystem, and that brands like, if you think all the biggest brands, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, are all built on ecosystems. They don't stand alone. They deliberately cultivate relationships with other companies, big and small. And so knowing where you stand in an ecosystem, are you the leader? Are you a small-time collaborator? Are you, a sort of a partner in that system, becomes a really important issue. And if you look at sort of technology and the way that brands are innovating, I mean, a lot of companies now are sharing their knowledge because it will help build the ecosystem. So they don't mind giving the IP away. In fact, they actively encourage other people to use their IP because they know that will then, lead to sort of an economy of scale that will make their ecosystem more powerful. So it's sort of a mixture of altruism that will also benefit individual companies. It's not pure altruism. There's a commercial benefit in it. But I feel like that's a more sensible way for a lot of organizations to start working.
And that's really interesting. I mean, do you think in terms of the role of the strategist then, do you think that might actually evolve more into sort of proposing interesting, useful partnerships, designing ecosystems, creating kind of the opportunity for companies to operate in a different way?
Yeah, definitely. And I think again, returning to that theme of luck, if you think about this through a very rigid sort of classical, conventional, approach, what you often do is create pretty predictable partnerships. So the classic partnership model is find somebody who is like yourself, and we will work nicely together. But actually, sometimes a more lateral approach is to find someone who's really quite different from you, who therefore has opposites attract and who has a sort of a complementary skill set. So we talked about that rainbow laces idea. Well, that was Paddy Power and Stonewall, and we brought them together because we knew that Paddy Power didn't have the credibility to talk about homophobia on its own without somebody like Stonewall, and we also knew that Stonewall couldn't reach football fans and sort of blokes, because they tried to do that before, but they weren't seen as being able to speak the language of these blokes down the pub or at the game. So by bringing them together, I can tell you that was one of the most. There's a series of meetings that the first one was terrible. It was like introducing your parents sort of thing. It was the most unlikely coming together of people you could imagine, very different sort of cultures. But actually, by the end of it, by the third meeting, they were really sort of appreciating that although they were chalk and cheese, actually they had amazingly complementary skill sets that would make this whole thing a brilliant success. And but in conventional thinking, you would not put Paddy Power and Stonewall together, but maybe we've got to do more of that going forwards. So I feel like that's quite a nice, exciting way to think of more lateral partnerships rather than just standard ones.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm just going to ask you my catch-all final question here, actually, if that's all right. And that's what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to it? So Andy, what's the question you wish that I'd asked you?
Well, I was going to say have you written a book? But you've talked about the book, which is very kind of you. But so my point actually is, why, or what is the cause that you've written this book for? Why have you written that? Because I'm giving all the royalties to an organization called Commercial Break, which is an organization that helps working class kids get a lucky break into our industry. And the reason I'd love to spend a couple of minutes just talking about them is that I think it's a bigger issue in our society. We've talked about luck. Well, there's a lot of people who don't enjoy the fortune that perhaps you or I have had, and it's in particular at the moment, it's so difficult to get into our industry, and I think we're all rightly talking about all forms of diversity right now, but one of the things that gets forgotten all the time is class and social class, and there's huge amounts of evidence now that is at the root of a lot of the other, there's a huge intersection with race in particular and various other sort of forms of diversity and discrimination, and so I would love class to get the hearing that it deserves, because a lot of the other themes that we've talked about today, that our need to make work that connects with people in the real world, will sort of only be addressed if we're diverse in terms of the social class of people we have in our agencies, and that's something that I think we're sort of in danger of forgetting.
And what's the barriers, do you think, that the industry puts up here?
I think we're all, without realizing it, terribly nice and middle class, and probably again, there's people don't hear the accents, that they it's quite London centric. I came down from Scotland 25 or whatever it was years ago, and the cost of housing was so much cheaper. I mean, it was expensive back then, but it wasn't at the horrific levels that you have today. So one of the things we've done as an agency is separate from the book is to invest in a flat that we will use. We're going to launch it just before the pandemic happened, so this didn't quite happen, but we're calling it the barracks. So we pay for interns accommodation when they come down to London for the first 3 months. So it's all paid for, all their accommodation, all their groceries and shopping. We get it from the Co-op or Amazon, and Yorkshire Tea, all our other clients are funding it. Because we know that one of the barriers is that you can find an amazing candidate, you can give them a really good London wage, but they still can't afford to work here because they don't have their parents live down here, they don't have a nice house that they can commute from. It's just so expensive to live in London. So I feel like we've got to work upstream to attract people by solving some of those problems, rather than what a lot of the time we just throw our hands up and say, yeah, well, that's not our industry, that's a societal problem. We can't solve the housing crisis. Well, of course we can't solve London's housing crisis, but we can, in our own little way, we can make sure that it doesn't prevent us from getting the best people for our jobs.
Fantastic. So that's a Commercial Break, that and all the proceeds of your book, Go Like Yourself, go towards Commercial Break. Yeah. So
royalties. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, everyone, please do support that and go buy the book. And so we're out of time, unfortunately, but if I could just say thank you, Andy, for being part of Firestarters again, and just brilliant to have you on. And thank you for all your insights. And everybody, just look out for future episodes of Firestarters. Don't forget to share and like the video. And my thanks again to Andy Nairn for being part of Firestarters. Thanks,
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.